How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And you?
Good. It's so nice to meet you, and thank you for doing this.
Not at all.
Are you in London?
I'm in London. Yeah, I live in London. I'm
Okay.
English, as you can tell.
Okay. That doesn't come as a shock.
No, I know. Yes.
Yeah. And okay. So I often I don't know if accused is a strong word for it, but question certainly, have we begun yet? And because I have this method where I don't do a sharp kind of, pivot and to starting the show. I just sort of ease into it typically.
Do it however you want.
So I kind of started when I edit, I kind of just sort of started where it makes sense to me.
Sure.
And sometimes that's just chit chat, because I feel like people do want to know what's going on, like informally between breaking down the walls of interview
Sure,
or
of course.
interview.
Yeah.
But your fellow countryman Mike Leigh was on yesterday.
Oh wow, I know Mike Leigh a bit.
Yeah, I've met him a number of times over the years, and they're about to begin tomorrow a retrospective, a big retrospective of his work, of his features.
Yeah.
Not his teleplays, but just his features. But that's quite sufficient, Anyway, so I was able to. I don't think a lot of people thought about like maybe Mike will be doing some press. I don't think so, because I think the reason I got him, other than my good relationships, is that I just think like few people thought to ask for him. No, it wasn't like in the press release.
Sure,
Mike Leigh is available for interviews. I just asked, and it happened because I happen to know his U.S. publicist, and he's a friend, and it worked out. But so he's prickly, and he doesn't suffer fools, and I'm unfortunately, I'm screwed. So no. Anyway, so what's happened in the past? The first couple of times I met him, I brought up the teleplays, and they were just what we got here in the States was awful in terms of the condition of the
like Abigail's Party and Nuts in May and all that stuff.
Exactly, everything.
Just tell me, as a matter of interest, I cannot imagine what anybody in America would think of Abigail's Party. I mean, it is so English and nuanced about the class system and the accents. I don't know how anybody would make sense of it in America.
Right. Well, retrofit it. Yeah, I could retrofit it to my love of his contemporary films. Because when I was, as I remind him every time, I was living in the city. I was younger, obviously much younger, and I was walking by a marquee that said "Life is Sweet," and I liked the poster. I didn't know who Mike Leigh was, and I walked in because because almost inevitably in that time in New York in the early 90s, late 80s, everything we were getting from the UK or just from abroad was just the best.
Sure.
Everything was reliably great. We were just in this wonderful period of time. And I was like just gobsmacked. I fell in love with his films, and I was like, what is going on here? Who are these characters? They were just so original to me. I grew up with Monty Python and a few other of the imports, but this was new, and I just thought this guy just is connected to me. He knows what I like. I just felt very connected to his film. So when I went back and watched the teleplays, to answer your question, it was just more. And I have an intellectual understanding of the class system. I've made many trips to the UK. And so for me personally, it was great. But yes, I mean, for most, I don't know if anybody saw it when they put them on Netflix, and they were horrible transfers. So when I brought this up to Mike Leigh, trying to show off and show him what a great fan I was and how knowledgeable I was of his work, this is not yesterday. This is going back. Yeah. He got so riled up because they were such horrible transfers that we got here, that he got very upset. So I realized maybe I shouldn't have brought that up at the time, Yeah. And then the last time I saw him before with Peterloo, he had just flown in from LA to New York City that morning, and he was for some reason, in a wonderful mood. He was in a great mood. And on top of that, the guy that was supposed to follow me, interviewing, couldn't make it. So he canceled. So they had an hour of time for me. So there I was sitting across from Mike Leigh, who was in a great mood for a full hour.
Good.
So I thought it was a wonderful experience. I mean, I was so, it was such a huge success. And then, so I thought yesterday I'll bring him, I was looking forward to it again. And this part will have to be edited out, as you said, but he was, more prickly and short clipped answers mostly. I mean, there were exceptions, and he was warm and gracious. And I think he knew that he was talking to somebody who was very familiar with his work, but it was not like,
hello, old friend.
Yeah. And, and if he had any memory of meeting before, that would always be nice, but he meets thousands. I mean, come on, it's just impossible. So
sure.
Anyway, that's the long story about that. But so it's nice to have another Englishman come on and not give clipped answers. I've heard you on Full Cast and Crew, and then I would have been wanting to read this regardless, because I just, it's the Cimino is, and that body of work in that period of time in American cinema is pretty important in terms of my being informed as a moviegoer back when I was a young person growing up. I would go to see everything. And so, but I heard you on there, and, I thought, oh, what a perfect guest this guy is. Cause he just he's engaged, you're engaged, you're, and you love to talk about the work, and you're excited to talk about it. And
I am. I mean, I kind of ramble, so you'll have to edit this carefully.
It's a rambling thing. So yeah, we'll see. We don't have to worry too much about it.
Great.
So anyway, thank you for again. And let's talk about your book, which I was so happy to read. You've written, besides working in the production world, or is it safe to say?
Yeah.
You've written novels before, but you haven't written a nonfiction work.
No, I wrote 2 novels while I worked for ITV. You know ITV?
Yes.
And I was an agent, first of all, representing
directors and
script writers. Then I became a producer, and on the side, I wrote a couple of novels. And I feel really I'm more of a producer than a writer, but I have written, and I couldn't think of another novel to write. And I mean, it's hard to explain what an unreconstructed kind of showbiz junkie I am. It is literally the only thing I know anything about. I can't do kings and queens of England, certainly not presidents of the United States, but I have a autistic Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man kind of memory for show business trivia. I could reel off, if you asked me to, but please don't, the cameraman on the last 15 Clint Eastwood movies. And I just got that kind of brain, which, believe me, does me no good at all. And
not as a producer?
Well, of course, the bizarre thing about television in England, more so than America, is that nobody appears to have ever seen any movies. When I was producing, working with directors, I would say, God, this scene is exciting. It could be a bit like, the opening of Touch of Evil, just one long take. And they look at me, they have no idea what I'm talking about. England is not a film culture in the way that it is in America. You never get people like Tarantino who learn to buy movies by working in a VHS shop and watching everything. People in England aren't I'm not saying they're not good directors, but I bet Mike Leigh is not the greatest cinephile in the world. I'm not saying
he has a theater background anyway.
Director.
Yeah.
In America, people love movies.
Well, part of it is I mean, you had
that's
like
a generalization, because
2 channels or something. I mean, when you were growing up.
2 channels. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we had at least 5 or 6 channels, and before cable.
And now we all have 500 channels.
Yeah, so it must be changing to some degree. But my first question to Mike Leigh, I mean, and not to keep going back to that necessarily, but was like, because he a lot of young people are going to see the films, and I'm just like, or coming to the retrospectives, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how do they, what is, or how do young people, are they so ubiquitous in England, and that there's a younger audience discovering his films? I'm just wondering how people find it, how they find, but yes, as you said, there's now like 500 channels or something, so
And
you
there's
could
no
get.
more to watch than there was when there were 2 channels.
True. Well, when did Cimino come on your radar originally? Do you remember?
Well, actually, sorry, just get back. I couldn't think
Yes,
up an
finish.
idea for
Sorry.
another novel, and actually, a friend suggested Cimino, and obviously, I knew tons and tons about him, and I thought, well, I don't know how you'd write a biography, and I sort of actually I just went to LA for a bit, which I love. And I found some people to talk to, and I began talking about it. And then gradually it seemed that I was writing it. And it was, it was a lovely experience. I hung out in LA talking about movies to movie people. What better thing is there than that? And I met, I had dinner with Roger Corman, who's aged about 90 something, sharp as a razor.
Yes, he's been on the show, actually.
I mean, great. I saw great people, and I just began doing it. And I think one thing that maybe makes it a bit different, which is not to say better, because I'm not saying it is better, is that I had that quality of being unencumbered by knowledge. I don't mean I didn't know about movies and Cimino. Being unencumbered by knowledge, I think, is a great quality to have, because it means you come at it freshly, and you don't think, oh, well, they tried doing it that way and it didn't work, so I won't bother trying to do it that way. You're completely fresh. And, I did all sorts of things that people said I was crazy to do. Like, I went to Kalispell, where they shot Heaven's Gate, and people said, but why are you going there? It was 40 years ago. Nobody will remember. And far from it. I put a little ad in the local news, online thing, saying, I'm writing this book. And I had like 60 emails from people. And I went to Kalispell and had the most incredible time. And everybody, as I say in the book, it was 40 years ago. Nothing as exciting had ever happened in Kalispell before Heaven's Gate arrived. And nothing has been exciting since. And people, shared their scrapbooks and their memories. I mean, I had to cut the 60 people down because there are quite a lot of people who worked on it for one day. But, I found all sorts of people like, Cimino's driver, his personal driver who drove him for 7 months, Chris Christopherson's stand-in. I just found great people. I had a lovely, lovely time. And that's sort of what I mean by being unencumbered by knowledge, because I didn't know what I was doing. And some of the things that I did that I didn't know what I was doing worked out really well.
Kalispell stood in for Casper, right?
No, it stood in for, yes, it did. Sorry, I get confused because they filmed the exteriors of Casper in Wallace, Idaho.
Okay.
But most of
that's
it
right.
most of it was shot around Kalispell. And they shot, of course, tons of it in the Glacier Park thing.
Sure. Right. Well, I mean, you're what's really the book is full of details like those about, setting up the production, how he figured all these things out. But then all of a sudden, you just, when you see the film, it's like you still are kind of like shocked by how he went from kind of figuring out so many moving parts. Do you feel like you got closer to understanding how this guy was operating on such an incredible level of where there was just, his films were big. I mean, at least initially, I mean,
well, he had a brilliant filmmaker's mind, even though actually he wasn't that interested in movies. He wasn't Tarantino. He wasn't a movie buff.
right.
And when he got to Hollywood in the early 70s, where it was full of Spielberg, George Lucas, Coppola, Brian De Palma, who were called the movie brats,
Right.
who hung around talking about kind of Jean-Luc Godard movies. And Cimino wasn't part of that set because he wasn't a kind of cinephile in that way, which isn't to say, I mean, you can not be a cinephile and still be a great filmmaker. And indeed, you can be an avid cinephile and not make good movies. Like, I mean, Peter Bogdanovich, the ultimate cinephile. Okay, Targets and Last Picture Show and What's Up, Doc, to some extent, were great, great, great movies from the mind of a cinephile. But
the O'Neill, the Ryan and Tatum,
Paper Moon,
of course.
But after that, despite having being the biggest cinephile in the world, the movies were absolutely terrible. I mean, most of them. I'm sure
I know, absolutely true.
Anyway, Cimino wasn't a cinephile, but he was brilliant at editing, which he learned from doing commercials in New York. And he was just an odd person. He just had a kind of knack for it, and he had an amazing eye for detail, incredible eye for detail. He edited brilliantly. He got really good performances, and you can argue that Heaven's Gate is a bit of a mess. It's very, very long. Does the battle sequence really earn its keep in the way that the similarly long wedding sequence in Deer Hunter does earn its keep? So I think there's tons wrong with Heaven's Gate. I mean, it's a bit of a plot-free zone, but it's an extraordinary and amazing film, because often things are amazing because of some of their faults as well as a lot of their brilliance. And it's discursive in the way that Barry Lyndon was discursive. I mean, I think Barry Lyndon is a greater film, but it was discursive. It's like reading a novel, it goes on for hours. I mean, Barry Lyndon was only 3 hours as opposed to 3 hours, 40 minutes like Heaven's Gate. But the weird thing is, the length thing, because he was always, as you know, very keen on the longer, the better. When I saw the first version I saw was the 2 hours, 40 minutes version. And I loved it. And I thought, if ever the long version was going to be shown, which was unlikely, except it was shown after a bit, I thought, well, I'll understand the story a bit more. I'll understand what John Hurt is doing in there. And when I saw the 3 hours, 40 minutes version, I didn't understand any more, because in fact, he didn't cut any scenes from the 3 hours, 40 minute version. He just made the scenes shorter. And, there was a 5 hour version, I mean, which would be the ultimate kind of butt numbing experience in the world. But it's still a great film. There are things wrong with it, but it's also almost unlike any other film. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make it a great film, though I think it is. But it's interesting to have something that appears to have no precedent. Of course, it's a Western, which has precedent, but it isn't like a John Ford movie. There are tons of things it just isn't like something else. And that made it interesting for me.
It would have been really interesting had this movie been more or embraced at all at the time, to see what he would continue to make. I mean, Unbridled, the problem was that other than Joanne Corelli, his producer partner, which we'll talk about her, but there was no one who could really rein him in. I don't even know if she really could. So while I would have been so fascinated to see what he would have done next, if he had a success with
that's a really, really interesting point, which I never really thought of. What would he have done after Heaven's Gate if he had the freedom to do what he wanted?
Yeah.
That's really, he would have done The Fountainhead for one thing.
Right, that's true. Right, scope.
But and there are people who are fans of Year of the Dragon, which at least of the later films is the most Cimino-like film. I think
It's
it's
quite
really,
watchable.
really flawed, but it is a Cimino film. I mean, Desperate Hours is just a terrible, terrible film. The Sicilian has some great sort of sequences, but it's a terrible script. It's silly, The Sicilian. It's just silly. Sun Chaser, his last film in 1996, I think is the most interesting of them. Not that it's a great movie either, but I think it's an interesting movie. But
it had ideas, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What he did, I think, after Heaven's Gate, and I don't blame him. I think if any of us had that shitstorm thrown at us, he kind of lost his confidence. And he was all facade and confidence. And he had a lot to be confident about. He was an amazing filmmaker, but suddenly without control, because essentially he didn't have control over the other movies, the last four movies, he was sort of, I think he found it hard to operate like that. And what he couldn't do was kind of make do with the projects. I mean, in fact, all the projects, in a sense, there was nothing wrong with them as ideas. The Sicilian was a giant best-selling novel by Mario Puzo. Desperate Hours had been a play on Broadway, had been a novel, a play on Broadway, and a movie. So it had a perfect, William Wyler did the movie. It was a perfectly serviceable project. And yet he couldn't do serviceable projects. It just wasn't in his nature somehow. And some directors who have fallen on hard times, like Orson Welles, he could turn a piece of schlock like Touch of Evil, despite it being re-edited, not drastically re-edited, but it was re-edited. He could turn a piece of schlock, have it tinkered with by the studio, and still turn out something that is almost a masterpiece. And there are other, I'm trying to think of other directors. I say in the book, actually, Scorsese, who actually isn't really like anybody else. He did The Color of Money, which again, wasn't his project. Paul Newman was already attached. Scorsese is used to total control. And he did The Color of Money, which again is kind of schlocky. Old dude is a mentor to young dude, which essentially is what it is. And yet he turns it into a kind of Scorsese movie. It's not my favorite of his movies, but he can take a project and mold it to himself, as Orson Welles did with Touch of Evil. And I'm sure there are lots of other examples, but I can't think of them. Cimino couldn't do that.
Well, well, and also not only because maybe just the type of passions the passion he had for what he wanted to make, but also he had a bit of an Achilles heel, his outsized ego, or he just seemed to have a self-destructive nature.
But his Achilles heels, as you call it, I mean, having a big ego for a director is not necessarily an Achilles heel. You could say it's essential.
That's true. Good point.
I mean, let's talk about monstrous egos. David Lean, Stanley Kubrick, Robert Altman, they all have outsized egos, and yet they managed to make it work. But the problem is, in a way that I say that Orson Welles molded Touch of Evil into being an Orson Welles film, ditto the Scorsese thing I was talking about. They were in a more powerful position. I mean, a bit more powerful, not Orson Welles so much, but Scorsese. But when, he molded Deer Hunter, which I go into the book, the weird genesis of Deer Hunter, he molded it into his own project. And when he, after the debacle of Heaven's Gate, when he was offered Footloose, which in one way is an unlikely project for him, but he loved musicals and was really good at dancing, as you see from, you know, the wedding sequence in Deer Hunter and the amazing opening sequence of Heaven's Gate and the road. You know, he loved all that stuff, and he tried to make it his own by. I interviewed Dean Pitchford, who wrote it. You know, Cimino wanted to change the original script completely. He wanted to open it. I mean, the movie, as it in the script and as it eventually was made, it begins with Kevin Bacon and his mother turning up in this weird town, you know, that they're not allowed
In Utah,
to dance.
right?
In Utah, they're not allowed to dance, i.e., a metaphor for they're not allowed to have sex. And Cimino's version was opening with a huge leaving party in Chicago, showing, you know, where the Kevin Bacon character came from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he was trying to make it his own. I mean, not unreasonably, but he wasn't allowed to. Whereas making Deer Hunter his own, he got away with it. Making Heaven's Gate his own, he certainly got away with it. I mean, in terms of making it his own, he didn't get away with it because it was such a disaster. But after that, he wasn't allowed to make a project in his own way.
Maybe timing played a part of his, you know, misfortune, in the sense that some of the filmmakers, had he been maybe around 5 years earlier, you know, he might have been able to, I don't know, I'm just thinking about what happened with the business, how, you know, Hollywood and all the studios became corporatized. Studios were being gobbled up by, you know, generic corporations, whether they were selling, you know,
Gulf and Western and
Gulf and what exactly.
And
so
Coca-Cola buying.
Right. So by the 80s, his style, regardless, I'm sure he would still have run into the same clashes with Robert Evans, for instance, or somebody like that. But they would have gotten a movie made, and he would have made another one. I'm almost certain of it. Yeah. But I think, given where the industry was by the 80s, I think it's just, you know, he wasn't going to be able to make it, and he, you know, by then he was a commodity as much as the films were for these corporations. They just didn't want to take the risks anymore, you know, with him. And, you know, he wasn't going to play that part. Whereas I think some of his contemporaries were better at playing ball, you know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons they were given more freedom was, of course, they were cheaper. And, you know, it's easy to have freedom if it's cheap. And, you know, all those early Scorsese movies, I mean, Taxi Driver, which didn't seem much of a commercial thing, it wasn't very expensive. Last Picture Show wasn't expensive. And of course, as the decade of the 70s went on, all those directors became more and more expensive, and the films became less and less good. But I think if you go in the way that Cimino did, wanting to spend the kind of money he wanted to spend, I think inevitably it was going to be harder for him, because he wasn't able to do a cheap movie. I mean, he did Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, which actually might be my favorite Cimino movie.
Really?
I love Thunderbolt and Lightfoot.
Me too. And that's, you know, since you brought it up, I mean, that was his first directorial job. He was came from, he was very successful in the world of advertising.
Yeah.
And so he started making these outstanding commercials, you know, and he was sort of got put on people's radar for that. And then, because he was making some very fresh new types of commercials.
Yeah, and his commercials are amazing. I mean,
you can see them on YouTube, right?
2 or 3 on YouTube. The one you won't see, I mean, you will see, because it's not credited to him. There's no credit. So if you put Cimino, it doesn't come up, is the Anne Margaret commercial he did for Canada Dry. Have you seen that?
No.
Put in Anne Margaret Canada Dry, and it'll come up. It doesn't say it's by Cimino, but it's
understood. Right. Yeah.
And they're the only 3 you can get are the Anne Margaret one, the United Airlines one, and the Pepsi Cola one. Those are the only ones I've found.
Remind me though how Clint Eastwood, who basically he was obviously like most directors at that time, unless you're coming out of film school, which absolutely did not come from that background of film school, like some of those other filmmakers we were talking about, the Scorseses and Coppolas, but he and the Brian De Palmas. But how did Clint Eastwood and him end up? How did their worlds end up converging?
Okay, well, I mean, like almost everything with Cimino, there are various different versions of it,
Sure.
of the story.
Right.
I mean, the version I think is probably most true is that Corelli, he wanted to get into features. He had written the script for Silent Running.
Oh, that's right. The Bruce
science
Stern
fiction movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with Bruce Stern, which is an interesting movie.
Oh, yes.
I mean, his original script was more interesting than the final script because Stephen Bochco was, who did all those famous TV things like Murder One and Hill, exactly. Stephen Bochco rewrote Cimino's script. I mean, he polished it. It wasn't like a complete rewrite, and made it much more commercial. Cimino's script was very bleak and uncompromising. And I can see why you might get Stephen Bochco in to warm it up. But in fact, Cimino's script is more interesting than the final film. Anyway, so he'd done that, but he wanted to direct. And Corelli said to him that what he should do is write a star vehicle for a hot star. And he wrote what was in LA by this time, and he wrote Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. And his agent, who was William Morris, was called Stan Kamen, but Stan Kamen's colleague, Leonard Hershen, was Clint Eastwood's agent. So it was an inter-agency thing. And he wrote Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, and it got sent to Clint Eastwood, who loved it. And Cimino, Clint Eastwood wanted to buy it. And Cimino, in a typically Cimino move, said he would only sell it to Clint Eastwood if he could direct it. And Eastwood has always, he's a very smart guy, he's always taken a chance on new talent, partly because I think he likes to do things cheaply, and new talent is always cheaper, because Clint Eastwood's films are always, he only does kind of one take of everything. All his films, I mean, even the expensive ones are cheaper than most expensive ones, if you know.
Sure, sure.
And he gave Cimino a little test first, which was to rewrite Magnum Force, the second Dirty Harry movie. Not a great movie and not a great script, but it's a workmanlike thing. And Cimino, John Milius had written it, or rather had written half of it, and then jumped ship because he went to direct a movie that he had written called Dillinger, about Dillinger, obviously, with Warren Oates. So he left the script half finished. So Cimino finished the script in a perfectly workmanlike way. And then Clint Eastwood let him to direct it. But, it was always clear that Clint Eastwood was the boss. And he made it very clear that if he didn't like what Cimino was doing, he'd sack him. And Eastwood is well known for sacking people who take too long, because he likes to do everything quickly. And on The Outlaw Josie Wales, Philip Kaufman, who later went on to do Right Stuff and Henry and June and all those movies. After 2 weeks, Clint Eastwood sacked him because he was taking too long, and Clint Eastwood directed it himself. I mean, that's what Clint Eastwood is like. And it actually went very, very well. It is a Cimino film. He wrote it and directed it. I mean, of course, it's a genre piece because it's a kind of caper movie, whatever you want to call it, buddy movie, caper movie, whatever. But again, he made it his own. I mean, he wrote it, so I suppose it's easy to make it your own. It's a great movie, and it was cut the way he wanted to cut it. Clint Eastwood believed in him. I mean, Clint Eastwood was an intuitive guy and a bright guy. He believed in Cimino. And the problem with it was that though it was pretty successful, nice reviews, And Jeff Bridges got an Oscar nomination. I mean, nobody has ever had an Oscar nomination in a Clint Eastwood movie until his later ones like Unforgiven and $1 Billion Baby. But at that time, Clint Eastwood was regarded as slightly kind of low rent. But of course, Cimino didn't really get any kudos from it because it was a Clint Eastwood movie. And actually almost no director of a Clint Eastwood movie, with the exception of Don Siegel, but Don Siegel was Eastwood's mentor and was obviously a great director before he worked with Eastwood. But most of the directors Eastwood worked with never had much of a career afterwards. I mean, Buddy Van Horn was actually a stunt coordinator who did the Deadpool, the last Dirty Harry movie, and I think he did Any Which Way But Loose, the Chimp movie, you know the one I mean.
Yeah, sure.
Ted Post, who did Hang 'em High, James Fargo, who did either Magnum Force or The Enforcer, the third Harry. You know, I don't mean they haven't worked, but they didn't go on to have great careers.
Right.
And it looked as if it was going to be that way with Cimino. You know, the offers didn't flow in after Thunderbolt and Lightfoot.
Right, because again, people remembered it as an Eastwood film, as you said.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's a good movie. I love it. I can't put my hand on my heart and say it's exactly a great movie, but it's a wonderful movie. But it was a Clint Eastwood movie.
Mm-hmm. But it was enough for him to figure out how to make the Deer Hunter.
Yeah, but I mean, the whole Deer Hunter story is a extraordinary, fluky thing. I mean, you couldn't quite say it was on the strength of Thunderbolt and Lightfoot that
Okay.
the Deer Hunter. But obviously, he had directed a movie, which, if you're going to be a director, it's better than not having directed a movie. And, you know, the word was good that you know, Clint Eastwood, you know, always gave him a really good rep, and they were friends right till the end of Cimino's life. But the Deer Hunter had a very peculiar genesis. Do you want me to go into this? I mean, it's
yes.
not unknown. There was a script that EMI had called The Man Who Came to Play, which was they had tried to get it off the ground. Nobody wanted to do it. And it's really—
This was the Russian roulette story, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty script because it's a Russian roulette movie, but it plays like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You know, it's a sort of fun Russian roulette movie. There certainly are many of them around. And it was sort of a comedy, but people got their heads blown off. I mean, it was a weird script. And he offered the script. He was sent to see if because it was a kind of genre piece, a movie. So he reads the script, he read the script. Corelli told me it was the worst script they'd ever read. And it's certainly, you can get it in one of the, you know, anniversary Deer Hunter box sets DVD. You can get the script. The script is included. So he went into the meeting and he said, you know, in a typically ballsy Cimino way, he said he didn't want to do The Man Who Came to Dinner. Sorry, that's another thing. The Man Who Came to Play.
Man Who Came to Play. It's a generic, terrible title.
And what he wanted to do was the Deer Hunter. Yes. He said he wouldn't do that. He pitched this movie, which was essentially very close to the Deer Hunter, the eventual Deer Hunter. And the only thing he kept in it was the Russian roulette, nothing else. And EMI loved it, and they bought it and they made it. I mean, it's a kind of weird story because it doesn't happen like that in Hollywood much.
Well, and then it went on to win every Oscar. So
sure. But it was a bloodbath to get to the Oscars. But yes, it did.
Yeah. Well, you know, a big part of the book, and let's remind people that this book is called Cimino, and it's available now anywhere books are sold. And I recommend it for anybody who is any interest in Michael Cimino or this period or those films we've been talking about, or just another Hollywood story, but I feel like, in terms of the man, now we've talked about the filmmaker quite a bit, but a large part of your book is really also about Michael Cimino, the man, and this very, very complicated person, and about who was caught up with reinventing himself throughout his life, and but never quite seemed to figure out who he wanted to reinvent himself into. Because I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if he had a really strong sense of self in some level, but his relation, and it extends to his relationships. Um, but on one hand, I wanted to mention one thing, and it felt like, as opposed to only trying to set the record straight, in your book about him, it's as though you really give him all the benefits of the doubt in terms of all of the criticism that was laid on him. You kind of really try to tease out, well, what was justified and maybe what was not justified. And there's almost at times an apologist approach to it. I know that sort of has a negative maybe aspect to that word, apologist, but it's not meant to, but I feel like you really, because obviously his relationships were often, there's only a couple of relationships he had over the course of his life that maintained, that were sustained. I mean, most everybody,
yes, absolutely,
estrange himself, or including his, core family members. And I was just wondering your thinking and your feelings about him as an author, maybe, or just as somebody who might have been a contemporary of his, in the sense of, growing up around the same time, or you're a bit younger, obviously, but like what your feelings were for him going into it.
Well, I mean, it's I guess finally a book about me trying to get to know a person who is unknowable. And you could argue that that's not a great book to have, because you never get to know the real story, and in a sense you don't. But that's interesting too. And there is nobody like Cimino in terms of as a filmmaker and as a person, because his life, and I was just as fascinated by his life as I was about his movies. And he's an interesting person. And as I've said before, failure is more interesting than success. In terms of a biography, I mean, you would read it and I would read it, but do I want to write a biography of Sidney Pollack? Not particularly. I'm not saying he's not a wonderful filmmaker, or Alan Pakula. He's a great filmmaker, but it's not an interesting story, unless you want to purely do a film book. Whereas Cimino's life was so fascinating and so bizarre and so finally inexplicable. And I was going to say I do my best, but it isn't that I do my best. I really put it out there, and I made a very conscious attempt not to editorialize. And I don't say, as I do in a few places, I don't really say what I think about Cimino. I put the varying stories, the Rashomon stories. I don't even say which one I particularly believe.
There's a journalistic approach to how you handle him, as
Yeah.
It's very.
I mean, that was a conscious effort not to. I mean, I do inject myself in it because it's the story of my journey and how I found these people and where I met them and what they were like. But I let them tell their story, and I don't. A lot of biographies, the author puts themselves into the mind of the person they're writing about. And there was one biography, I can't remember who, that I read, in which the author writes, it must have been with some relief that he left the cold weather of Switzerland for the warmer climes of Malibu. I mean, maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. But how the author knows that, I don't know. And I didn't want to do any of that with Cimino. He must have been disappointed that. I kept all of that out of it. and really just let him make. I mean, maybe that's lazy of me.
So no supposition, right?
No, I didn't want to suppose anything.
Well, let's give. Just wanted for people that are listening who may not know a lot about him and his personal life. I just want to give brief series of examples of that you go over in the book. There is his relationships with his family, who ultimately he cut himself off from. There's his relationship with Joanne Corelli, maybe the core person in his life who the closest to him throughout the span of his life, who he never, I doubt, ever had any kind of intimacy with, other than maybe as a friend. Although I'm not going to suppose. I'm going to follow your approach. And then there's his relationship to Joanna's and David Mansfield, who is the musician and who scored Heaven's Gate. Joanne and David would marry and have the daughter Calantha. Am I pronouncing it Calantha?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Calantha.
And then kind of suggesting to the public that he was her father. And then, of course, late in life, his sort of his reconstructing his physical presence.
Yeah.
You really kind of do. I learned a lot about, and was able to kind of, in my own mind, answer some of the questions I had, thanks to you. Like most maybe the most so with what was going on with him in terms of, I don't know that he was, and step in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't. There seemed to be an idea that he was transitioning gender.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like that's what was going on. I think you hit it on. I think he was trying to, I'm not saying he didn't. I feel like the cross-dressing was more what he was after, and presenting himself as a female when he wanted to.
Yeah.
It's an only odd in the sense that we're not accustomed to it typically, not that whatever goes, he's not harming anybody, and it was who he was. But do you feel that's kind of more what he was after? I'm just
again, I didn't want to give my opinion,
right?
And nobody wants to hear me talk about gender issues.
Just me.
And I found in the book, I was very lucky actually that I found her, and the woman who was his mentor in the cross-dressing thing, I can't think of a better way of putting it. And I had maybe 70 emails from her, and I spent with her in Palm Desert in Yucca Valley near Palm Springs. And she, she's an amazing woman, but she wasn't looking to talk.
Right.
She wasn't looking for publicity.
Which are the best subjects, I assume.
Exactly. And I just told her story, and so the chapter, I mean, I had to construct a kind of narrative out of it, but I put together the 70 emails and my day-long interview, which are all incredibly long, and I kind of cut it down into a narrative, but everything in the chapter are her words, and I don't think at any point I say what I think about it. And I wanted it to be curiously dreamlike, and a lot of the book, because there was a lot of, in the Cimino diaspora, that's what I mean, there were a lot of weird people. I mean, really a lot of weird people. And, the book is to some extent about them and what they saw in Cimino. So it was a bit like writing a novel, which I'm better at than writing biographies. It helped that I'd written novels, because a lot of it is like a novel. And I introduced characters in it, like Joanne, sort of as if they're characters in a novel who have suddenly walked into the action. But again, I try not to give my opinion, because I'm bored of people giving their opinions about things generally.
Yeah. Well, I just felt terribly. And then I went, after I read the book, I just started looking on YouTube, because there is actually a number of interviews or appearances that he made late in life. That,
there really are quite a few.
yeah, and you can really get a sense, because of course he was late in life. There was a re how would you say it, Charles? There was a new, what's that?
A reevaluation.
Examination.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes.
With it's Heaven's Gate, and of course,
yeah, exactly.
the Criterion getting, doing this project was part of that. A re-examination, and seeing what really what was a work of brilliance, and which it was in a way. Of course, I mean, anybody who's been thrown under the bus quite the way he was before the movie even came out, it was DOA, but it's a bittersweet thing, right? Because on one hand, he's finally getting this love that he so desperately wants. On the other hand, he always knew what it was, and that it has nothing to do with his ego. He just he knew he was doing something that was great, and that people just need to get out of the way.
It was nice that he had all that, because I was sort of worried. I mean, there's nothing I can do about it because it's a story, that it was kind of depressing, the end of his life.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, in some ways it was a bit depressing, but it gave it his reevaluation in Europe, particularly over the last 20 years of his life. And in 2012, I think it was, the Criterion thing, it was, for my book, it gave what in Hollywood we'd call an uplift ending, or at least a bit of an uplift ending. And I think it was wonderful all that happened, because Heaven's Gate is a great movie. And the ridiculous thing is that, how opinions change. I mean, you can get, I mean, there are tons of examples, like, Van Gogh, as you say in America. Van Gogh, nobody ever bought a single painting of his, and now they're going for, $150 million at Sotheby's. So, of course, artistic opinion changes. But I always think a lot of the stuff with a lot of things in Hollywood are to do with which way the wind is blowing. I mean, it is as ephemeral as that. And you get Heaven's Gate, and for a variety of reasons I go into, it was a disaster commercially. And, there are reasons for that. It was because he was a spiky, difficult person. A lot of directors like Spielberg or
Coppola,
they could schmooze. They were very good at dealing with the press.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're good at making friendships in the business, or at least
which Cimino didn't at all.
Right.
And the thing about him banning the press, there are all sorts of reasons why Heaven's Gate got bad reviews, but I didn't put it in the book because I only sort of thought about it the other day. 10 years after Heaven's Gate, you get Dances with Wolves. I mean, Dances with Wolves, which I haven't seen for a long time, it is a plot-free zone. It's co-written and directed by Kevin Costner, who'd never directed a movie. Plot-free zone, half of it is in, it's about the Lakota, I think, Native Americans, and half of it is in Lakota language with subtitles. There are a million reasons why Dances with Wolves could have turned into a Heaven's Gate disaster, but it didn't. Of course, it was a bit cheaper than Heaven's Gate. It only cost $20 million, but it grossed like $500 million. And that's what I mean about the way the wind blows, because there's no reason why you would think Dances with Wolves would work for an audience. I'm not saying it's not it's not as great a movie as Heaven's Gate. I think it's a fine movie, but there's no way you could predict that was going to happen. And yet it did happen. So I think a lot of luck is involved.
But they're also, you're right. I mean, I think, not to belabor, but probably a lot of people Kevin Costner was a proven success as an actor. He kept building bigger and bigger audience over time, and he was able to do that. And there were probably the business where the Hollywood was rooting for him, and they weren't necessarily rooting for Michael Cimino.
Have you seen The Postman?
Let's not get carried away.
But you could argue that Kevin Costner, against the odds, had pulled Dances with Wolves out of the hat and made a huge amount of money. And then he wants to do The Postman. Everybody likes Kevin Costner. He's made a successful movie. He's a popular guy. And let's talk about watching The Postman.
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody did watch The Postman.
Right.
So that's what I mean about fluke.
And who watched Waterworld, for that matter?
Well, actually, Waterworld, I don't suppose it earned its money back. It didn't do particularly badly.
Okay.
And actually, it is a weird and rather wonderful movie in a way.
Okay. Maybe it's time to. I think we've come across your next subject, frankly.
Yep.
There hasn't been a thorough examination of Kevin Costner's films.
No, it hasn't.
Well, I don't know if I did a good job of enticing more people to read your book, but I'm going to really suggest anybody, again, who's remotely interested in any of the subjects we've talked about, but most importantly, Michael Cimino. I mean, at the end of the day, you made a half a dozen movies worth evaluation, if not, more than that. And really and with the trifecta of Thunderfoot, Thunderfoot
and Thunder. God, now you've got me forgetting it. Thunderbolt and Lightfoot.
Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, excuse me. Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, and of course Deer Hunter and Heaven's Gate, and yeah, there's a good 4 or 5 films where, I mean, that's a career. That's an amazing career. So it was. I'm glad somebody finally. There are probably other books, I haven't seen them, but it's great timing for this book right now.
There is no book about Cimino.
Okay.
So in that sense, I was kind of lucky.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm glad finally. Then the record has been straightened. I'd recommend it. Cimino, The Deer Hunter, Heaven's Gate, and The Price of a Vision by Charles Elton, published by Abrams Press. And I'm very grateful for the folks at Abrams for putting us together today. And
no, they've been great. Abrams have been wonderful. They've been behind the book always.
Yeah,
very, very happy experience.
That's great. And have you been able to do any public appearances with the book at any screening opportunities?
Well, the trouble with doing a screening, if you did a screening and a Q&A, after 3 hours and 40 minutes of Heaven's Gate, literally people would be running to the exit.
No, it doesn't work for that.
Without listening to me.
Right. No, you'd have to do maybe Thunder. Well, I think a good one to do would be with Thunderbolt, because I think it's a less recognized film. And when
it is absolutely.
I'm a junkie, and and I hadn't seen it till the last bunch of. I don't remember when I saw it, but it was definitely in the last 5 years. I'm 58 years old. I mean, how did it take me so long? Maybe the title, as something as superficial as that. I don't know. But when I saw it, I was just like, wow, how did I wait so long? But I was grateful because, I got to see it for the first time as, well, thank you very much.
Listen, thank you. I've really enjoyed that. Great.
Thank you again. Thanks again. And have a great evening. I guess it's right. It's
afternoon.
It's still afternoon.
Yeah.
I know. Okay. I gotta go to work myself. So
okay.
I'm glad we did.
Good to talk. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.